Interesting fact. First Eurostar trains running between London and Paris through the tunnel were also equipped with a third rail shoe. And it was used not in the tunnel. It was used on the British railway lines, because the British part of high-speed railway wasn't constructed yet, and the Eurostar had to use the existing British railway network that was electrified by a third rail. But why? Why through all over the world the railway uses overhead wire, but the Great Britain decided to electrify its railway with a third rail like a subway? Let's figure it out. If you are interested in British or American railways, you might notice that some railway lines use a third rail instead of common overhead wire. But such type of electrification might be more common for subway systems rather than for ground railroad. Because the railway track is constantly exposed to weather conditions, foreign objects getting on the way, and has a large number of road and pedestrian crossings. So why was it decided to use a contact rail on ground railway instead of overhead wire? Well, there are several reasons for it. First of all, it's worth saying that the third rail was invented a little earlier than the overhead wire for railways. An experimental electric train using this method of power supply was developed by the German firm of Siemens and Halske and was shown at the Berlin Industrial Exposition of 1879, with its third rail between the running rails. Some earlier electric railways even used the running rails as the current conductor, like many of model railways do. So, even the first trams used a third rail with its special constructions that prevented occasional contact with people, horses and cars that always crossing the tram tracks. Until the 1890s, the electric power was used only on a city public transport, trams and subway. The first attempt to use electric power on mainline railroads was made in 1895 by Baltimore and Ohio Railroad on its Baltimore Belt Line. Due to the hilly terrain, the most part of line through the town was in tunnels, which posed severe ventilation problems, especially with the using of steam locomotives. Large chimneys was constructed above the Howard Street Tunnel in a not entirely successful attempt to disperse the fumes from the coal-fired locomotives. And in 1892, the Burlington and Ohio contracted with General Electric for electric locomotives, powerhouse equipment, and an electrical distribution system. And the first train pulled by electric locomotive operated through the Howard Street Tunnel on June 27, 1895. Going up grade, the electric locomotives were coupled to the front of the train at Camden Station and pulled the entire train, including the steam locomotive, through the Howard Street Tunnel. When northbound passenger trains stopped at Mont Royal Station, at the north end of the tunnel, the electric locomotive was uncoupled. Since the steam engine was not working, the smoke produced was relatively light. Firstly, the electric power was supplied through a unique system, in which a pickup shoe rode in a channel above and to one side of the track. This proved vulnerable to contamination from coal smoke, and after a short time it was replaced by a conventional third rail system. But here the electric locomotives were used only as a tug for steam trains. The next and more famous electric mainline railway, using electric locomotives as main power, appeared in New York. After a disastrous accident in the Park Avenue Tunnel, the New York legislature passed a law banning steam locomotives within the city limits, effective in 1908. Seeing an opportunity, the railroad decided this could mean a chance to completely rebuild its congested Midtown Manhattan terminal and yard facilities. The electrification project would see not only the construction of the new Grand Central Terminal, but miles of completely underground platforms and yard tracks, which would not have been possible with exhaust-producing steam locomotives. Thus, it was decided to use a third rail electrification, and in 1904, the world's first mass-produced mainline electric locomotive S1 was built by American Locomotive Company and General Electric. And after more than 100 years, this railroad still uses a third rail electrification. Comparing to the overhead wire, that in those times has already started to be widely used on tram lines, the third rail had a number of significant advantages. The main of them is a reliable contact with current collectors located on the running parts of train bogies. and there is no oscillation of the current collectors and their separation from the contact rail, and consequently contact disruption and breaking of the current circuit, sparking and arcing that destroy the contact surfaces. Also, the third rail is highly reliable and durable, easy to repair and maintain, and has lower resistance to district current because of its larger cross-section, and especially for British railways, there is one more historical reason to use a third rail on some lines. As the railroad in Great Britain is very old, a large number of tunnels and bridges was built according to old carriageway standards, and were too low to stretching the overhead wire. It was much easier and cheaper to electrify tracks with a third rail. But if the third rail is so perfect, why for most railway systems around the world the overhead wire is more common? Well, with all its advantages, the third rail also has a number of significant drawbacks that made overhead wire more efficient during the technical progress. In addition to vulnerability to weather conditions such as floods and snowdrifts, the third rail has poor power transmission over long distances, requiring more frequent substation infrastructure and effective only on low voltages and only district current, while the overhead wire can run with either district or alternate current, use high voltages, and with all of this, it is much more safe than a low-lying third rail. Also, the third rail is not compatible with high speeds, having its limit to 100 miles per hour or 160 kilometers per hour. Therefore, in the modern times, the most of railways in the world prefer the overhead wire, leaving the third rail effective only for subway systems. But some railway lines still use a third rail from those times when it was the best way to bring in electric power to the world's railways for the first time. But if the first trams were also electrified by a third rail, how did they not electrocute people and horses always stepping on it? Or they did. This is the topic for one of the next videos.